Our next session, we have a really powerful morning this morning, is Professor Andrew Mcleod, and I had a two-page bio here, and Andrew happened to see me with that, and he said, "Oh, look, come on, just say he's all right, listen to him." Well, that's fair enough, but I've got to say a little bit more than that. Andrew, who was supposed to be speaking yesterday, was held up in Dallas, but that's another story which is a subject of its own speech. He's going to set the scene for today. He has an extensive resume. He is a professor, a non-executive chair of the British-based Griffin Law, and a non-executive director of the New York-based Cornerstone Capital, visiting professor at King's College London. He's a recognized global leader, negotiator, and communicator in business, diplomatic and humanitarian fields. And I must say his track record of actually being in the field is amazing. He's served in Geneva, that's quite an easy field, Tajikistan, Niger, Philippines, the Balkans, Rwanda. He's been involved ran the law of armed conflict training with military units in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. So he's just had so many experiences. He's an author and a communicator. He is a very knowledgeable and experienced person in the areas of humanitarian resolution of issues, and I had a great conversation with him last night talking about the fact how these things are never easy, and sometimes the feeling that we're doing good things can lead us into the trap of not realizing that we're not doing good things well, and that's a constant reminder to all of us as to how we can deal with that. So we have no more appropriate speaker at this stage than Andrew Mcleod. Please welcome Andrew Mcleod.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Let me just prepare the stage how I like it. As has been indicated, I was supposed to be opening the conference yesterday, and thanks to Qantas, I got stuck in Dallas for 24 hours. I can't be too angry, though, for two reasons. One, planes are supposed to go up and come back down again, and if planes don't come back down in the way they're planned, you guys are pulling me out of a steaming wreckage, and I'd rather that not happen. But the other thing, in life we have big bucket lists like I want to see Machu Picchu or I want to go to the Antarctic. And we also have little bucket lists, the sort of thing that if you just happen to be nearby, you go and do. And if you're a child of the 1970s and 80s like I am, one of the TV programs I loved to watch was Dallas. So I got the great privilege of going to South Fork Ranch and asking that question, who shot JR? Now, we know who it was, so although I'm upset that I wasn't here to open the conference yesterday, I did get to see South Fork Ranch. I also want to pick up on something that Georgie was just talking about post-traumatic stress disorder as well. And I need to underline how important it is that emergency workers like yourselves do become increasingly aware of that and make sure all of our staff and people we work with know how important the issue it is and that we don't stigmatise it. For example, as has been roughly touched on, I've spent a lot of time in the field in some of the world's most notorious disaster zones and conflicts like Rwanda, Afghanistan and others. And I can tell you for returning aid workers, post-traumatic stress disorder is a huge problem. And I spent a few years on the board of a group called the Mandela Foundation, which gives psychosocial support to returning aid workers. And if you think about it this way, we understand the need for RSLs, Return Services Leagues, and the need for returning servicemen and women to be able to have a safe space to speak with each other about some of the traumatic experiences they went through in conflict. But think about it from an aid worker's perspective. Aid workers have often spent longer in an armed conflict scenario than many soldiers have. And indeed, over the last 3 decades, Australia has sent many, many more aid workers to conflict zones than we have soldiers. Yet where is the RSL for aid workers? Where is the safe space that aid workers come together and share those traumatic experiences? You, having been frontline emergency workers, know what it's like to see human bodies in some of the most indescribable circumstances and how some of the shadows of those visions never leave your mind. And many aid workers suffer post-traumatic stress disorder. And because it's such a misunderstood element in our community, they have a huge difficulty getting over that. So I can only underline what Beyond Blue said. Be very aware of it and make sure that everyone within your chain of commands knows that it is not in any way shameful to have mental health issues following catastrophes. We all have it, I have it, and I'm sure many of you deal with many of your demons. But that's not the purpose of my presentation today. My presentation today is to take you out of the weeds and up into the big picture for a moment, to talk about some of the leadership lessons that I have derived from 6 conflicts and numerous natural disasters around the world, then talk about some of the great cultural change that's happening in the world today, and then bring that down to direct relevance to your work and how you and your teams need to confront some of the huge cultural, economic and psychological challenges that are facing the communities in Australia and how your teams need to deal with that. I'm going to speak for about 30 or 40 minutes, then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. But if you have a question at any time during my presentation that you think needs to be dealt with right now, whack up your hand and ask the question. I have no problem being interrupted at all. I want to start off with one of the great lessons of leadership, which is this: only fools and fanatics are certain of themselves, but wise people are full of doubts. Good leaders always want to be challenged. Bad leaders think they are always right. And we know that, and we know people within our networks, and I hate to say it, there'll be some people in this room that always think they're right, or at least try to promote that image. So let me talk about this a little bit more. Let me talk about some of the leadership lessons from my life experience. Before I talk about this lesson 1, let me set the scene of lesson 1. Some of you might remember a big earthquake that hit Pakistan in 2005 on the 8th of October. In 90 seconds, a 7.6 magnitude earthquake wiped out 56,000 square kilometres, made 3.5 million people homeless, killed 74,000 people, injured 140,000 people in rough Himalayan terrain 6 weeks before a winter snow was about to fall down, covering everyone in 20 feet of cold, frozen water. To make it a little bit more confusing, the territory where this earthquake hit had a line of control running through it. The line of control is an internationally recognised ceasefire line between 2 nuclear powers technically at war, India and Pakistan. And to confuse it a little bit more, the territory was controlled in part by Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is the terrorist group that did the Mumbai bombings, and the Pakistan Taliban, who we all know well. And in the middle of that, we wanted to send thousands of international aid workers, largely white, largely Christian, to give humanitarian assistance in some of the most conservative Islamic territory you'll ever find in the world. How do you do that? In the first week, I deployed within 24 hours of the earthquake. I came on a thing called UNDAC, the United Nations Disaster Assessment and Coordination Team. The earthquake hit at 8:30 on a Saturday morning, local time, about 5:30 in the morning, Geneva time. Saturday is a working day in Pakistan. Pakistan has a split weekend. Friday is a day off, Friday prayers, and Sunday is a day off, but Saturday isn't. So Saturday's a school day, and at 8:30 in the morning, where are school kids? They're all going into school buildings. School buildings are built by governments. Governments are always penny pinching. Therefore, they don't build good quality architecture. So what happened to the school buildings is they collapsed. And one of the great killers in earthquakes is a modern invention called concrete. Because concrete has no resilience if not built properly, walls tend to fragment and cement roofs tend to pancake people. So roughly half of the 74,000 people killed on that day were school kids in school. And because earthquakes don't bring the roof down immediately, sometimes it takes 10, 15, 20 seconds, some of the kids were running out. So some of these roofs caught the kids halfway out. And some of the parents were sitting for days with a child half caught under concrete and half not. Tragic. So I arrived within 24 hours. Pakistan then was a military dictatorship under Pervez Musharraf, but if anyone knows anything about Pakistani or Indian bureaucracy, I don't think anyone can be a dictator when you're dealing with that degree of bureaucracy. And we needed to figure out, who did you deal with? Who did you actually work with in a military dictatorship to bring a whole bunch of foreigners with cameras, GPS, radios, right near the line of control where they're fighting a war in the middle of an Islamic fundamentalist insurgency? This is going to be a big issue. It took us about a week to convince the General High Command they needed to see us. So we went down to the GHQ, General Headquarters, in Rawalpindi to talk about how we were going to combine our resources, the international community, with their resources, the Pakistan Army, to keep 3.5 million people alive during a Himalayan winter. And the interesting thing about that number is people often judge natural disasters by the death toll. 74,000, that's huge, but it wasn't as big as the tsunami. Nearly 200,000 people killed. But if I'm going to be brutal, and you people know this very, very well, dead people don't need help. Survivors do. You judge the size of a natural disaster response by how many people were injured and how many people were made homeless. Pakistan earthquake injured 140,000, the tsunami injured 100,000. The Pakistan earthquake made 3.5 million people homeless, the tsunami made 1.5 million people homeless. Even though the death toll was lower, the humanitarian toll, the people who needed help, was much higher than the tsunami. And the tsunami impacted on 6 countries, predominantly 3. Pakistan earthquake hit 1. The humanitarian burden on the government of Pakistan, therefore, was 6 times higher than the humanitarian burden on any country in the tsunami. But we didn't hear about it. We didn't hear about it partly because people could empathise with beaches in Thailand, but people couldn't empathise with remote villages in the Himalayan foothills. So in this context, what do? We got called down to GHQ in Rawalpindi. A guy named General Muhammad Yusuf, the Director General of Military Operations, was leading the negotiation and discussion from the Pakistan Army side. It was him, a whole bunch of his generals on one side of the table. I was leading the negotiations for the UN with a whole bunch of other UN people on the other side of the table. The beginning of the meeting was in a way that you could predict. Each of us talking about the information we knew. Each of us talking about how big the challenge was. Each of us talking about what we were going to do. And then Muhammad Yusuf did what I describe as the bravest example of leadership I have ever seen anywhere, ever, full stop. In his own army headquarters, in a military dictatorship, surrounded by his generals, Muhammad Yusuf did the bravest thing possible. In front of a whole bunch of foreigners, he put his head in his hands and he said, "We do not know what to do." And by saying, "I don't know," it allowed us to really open up the discussion, because my response to him was, "Sir, neither do we. But we've got all these helicopters we can bring in, we've got these resources." And he looked across at his general in charge of the air wing and said, "They've got helicopters." So while their general in charge of the helicopters spoke to my guy Philippe Monteau, head of the UN Humanitarian Air Service, about helicopters, I wrote on a piece of paper, "Sir, this is the biggest challenge of your life, but together we will win." I folded it up and passed it across the table. He unfolded it, he smiled, he called the meeting to order and he said, "We can work with these people." We only had the entry point because Muhammad Yusuf was brave enough to admit what he did not know. He did not know what to do. And if he had have bullied his way through, if he had have pretended we know how to handle this, we would not have been able to create the collaborative relationship we did create, to be able to create a whole series of unusual partnerships that I will start talking about in a minute. So leadership lesson 1 for me is this one. It is the most important one. Admit what you don't know. Be open to your teams about how you want help and where you need help, so you can combine discoordinated resources. Lesson 2, it's linked to this one. Be told you are wrong. And let me start with this first name, Brigadier Rowe. He's actually a South Australian. He was the brigadier in charge of the 9th Brigade of the Australian Army. And back in 1989, I was a young officer cadet in the Australian Army. I was the president of my mess committee, and Brigadier Rowe was visiting. And as the president of the mess committee, I had to host him around. I said, "Hey, sir, what's the worst thing about being a brigadier?" And he looked at me and he said, "Everyone wants to kiss my ass. No one wants to tell me when I'm wrong." And I filed away into the back of my memory bank, ooh, a good leader wants to know when he's wrong. So in the 1990s, I found myself working in Rwanda. And my job was to negotiate security and access guarantees for the aid workers, to implement law of armed conflict training programs to reduce civilian casualties in the conflict. And one of my key interlocutors was a fellow named Paul Kagame. Paul Kagame is now the president of Rwanda, but back then he was the vice president, general in charge of the army and in charge of the secret police. He's not a guy you piss off in a country like Rwanda, that back then had no police force, back then had no judiciary, back then was recovering from the genocide, and there were an ongoing civilian casualty toll of about 800 a week from ongoing inter-Rahamwe attacks coming across the border from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Interestingly, by the way, as a quick aside, if I mention Rwanda, what are the first 2 or 3 words that jump into your mind? Anybody? War? Pardon? Guerrillas? What else? Genocide. Interesting. No one said economic growth and safety. So here's a concept I'm going to return back to later in the presentation about how bad our culture, white Anglo-Saxon Europeans, is at respecting change outside of our culture. The World Economic Forum listed countries 0 to 150 about 3 weeks ago, listing them by safest country in the world. Between 0, or 1, safest, and 150, unsafest, where would you put Rwanda? Anyone? Pardon? Give me a number. 80th? Someone else? 100? Guess where they were? 9. 9. Safer than the UK, safer than the US, safer, shock horror, than Australia. Phenomenal change has gone through Rwanda over the last 20 years. I'll talk about that more in a minute. So Kagame, a very strong leader of people. And I know that because he won the war that stopped the genocide. Pretty impressive. He stopped, after the genocide, Tutsis taking revenge murder against Hutus on a massive scale. And what he's done with Rwanda, taking it from unambiguously the least safe country in the world in 1994 to the 9th safest country in the world 2017, is pretty impressive. So how did we start our relationship? I had a fellow named Andrew Rugamba, who was the chief of the military prosecutor general in the Rwandan army. And we were dealing with things, and because I'd been an officer, he gave me the great privilege of being allowed to drink in the Rwandan Army officers' mess, one of only 2 white guys allowed in there, me and the American military attaché. The American military attaché was bringing guns, so you could understand why he was allowed there, and I just got lucky enough to be allowed in. And I noticed on Wednesday night Paul Kagame had come in, and he'd play billiards. Like billiard tables everywhere, the winner stays on, right? And the thing with Kagame is everyone will let him win. He would walk in, he'd play against some major, and he would win, so everyone else in the army officers' mess would play against him all night. So I turned around to Andrew Rugamba one day and I said, "Sir, any chance I can play General Kagame in a game of billiards?" We'll see. So next week they said, "Andrew, you'll be allowed to play the General tonight." Oh, okay. And I thought in the back of my mind, Kagame is a good leader of men, and I bet he hates being allowed to win. So I'm going to beat him. Now, I'm not the world's greatest billiard player, but either is a guy who's always allowed to win. A guy who's always allowed to win, honestly, is a pretty crappy billiard player. So picture this, Rwandan Army officers' mess, a whole bunch of military leaders that have a different skin colour to me, so I stand out. They've fought and won a very brutal war, and I'm now playing their commander in a game of billiards, and I'm starting to win. And you can see in every eye, in the officer's mess, what's this Mzungu doing? Mzungu is, well, it can be a derogatory term for white people, let's just put it that way. What's the Mzungu doing? Keep on playing, the whole room goes quiet, and I look up and I said, "What is it, me against the world?" And every eye looking back said to me, "Yes." I'm like, geez, I hope I get this right. Getting down to the last couple of balls and I'll win. And the whole room goes silent. And Kagame just quietly passes the billiard cue over to some major, start playing, and everyone in the officer's mess is saying to this major, take this shot, except Kagame, who came over to me and said, "Andrew, take this shot, take this shot." And suddenly everyone got the message. He hated being allowed to win, and he was never allowed to win again. And he had to win off his own merits. And by the time I left Rwanda, our game score was exactly tied, and I promised him I'm coming back to Rwanda one day and we're playing one more game of billiards. And I'm still yet to do that, but the lesson's important. Good leaders like to be told when they're wrong, like Brigadier Rose said, and like in a game of billiards, General Kagame demonstrated. The middle name on this list, Nadeem. Lieutenant General Nadeem Ahmed, Pakistan Army. After we had that meeting with Mohammed Yusuf, we were told within 48 hours we'll come back and have another discussion with the Pakistani High Command about their earthquake. We got called back within 24 hours. General Nadeem, who was the Vice Chief of General Staff, and Mohammed Yusuf, the Director General of Military Operations, Mohammed Yusuf's boss, was now chairing the meeting. And we came in a very military way. General Nadim said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to task UNICEF to do this, we're going to task Red Cross to do this, we're going to task MSF to do this, we're going to task Oxfam to do this. And I thought in the back of my mind, that's not going to work. Any of you who know how the aid world works and international NGOs work, there is no command and control structure. In fact, I like to tell people there's no such thing as the United Nations. There's a whole bunch of discoordinated agencies with the letters U and N in front of their name, a fascination with the colour blue, and then that's it. They raise their money in different ways, different command and control mechanisms, and they'll compete before they collaborate on the ground. It's really quite frustrating. So General Nadim had made one error in his assumption about the battlefield in front of him. He assumed that the international community had a command and control structure that mirrored his command and control structure. He was wrong. The other thing I learnt in the army, though, was never, ever contradict a general in public. So I looked across the table at him and said, "Sir, can I have a word alone with you?" And he was smart enough to know what I was about to do. He said, "Yeah, okay." And we went into a little side room. And I said, "Sir, that plan's not going to work." Oh, sorry. I told him the story of Brigadier Rowe first. And when I told him the story of Brigadier Rowe and Brigadier Rowe said, "Everyone wants to kiss my ass," General Nadim laughed, so I knew he got the point. And I said, "Sir, your plan's not going to work." He said, "Why?" And I told him there's no such thing as the UN. And I went through all the different NGOs, telling him the different characteristics they had, and telling him that error of information, that there is no command and control structure that mirrors his. He said, "Well, what do we do then?" I said, "It's easy. We get the NGOs to cherry pick the activity that they want to do, so long as they inform us what they're doing, so we have visibility on the gaps, and then we backfill the gaps with the Pakistan Army." It's a program we call Non-Interfering Coordination, and we've been published on it many times since. But we could not have done that if Nadim was not open to being told when he was wrong. So those first two lessons, admit what you don't know, Yusuf saying, "We do not know what to do," and Nadim open to being told when he was wrong so he could get new information, ended up creating a better plan. In a natural disaster, you assume a badly run humanitarian operation. You'll have a second wave of deaths roughly equivalent to the first wave of deaths. In other words, a badly run natural disaster operation in Pakistan would have seen a second wave of deaths of about 74,000 people. You know what our second wave of deaths was? 811. 811 people died in the Himalayan region during winter. That was lower than the normal death rate in winter anyway. In other words, by all the quality of life indicators that you measure, the quality of life of the people in the earthquake zone went up after the earthquake because we were able to combine resources of the international community and the Pakistanis. We got UK MIL, US MIL, PAC MIL, UN helicopters, all centrally tasked out of one air operations cell because we got people to collaborate on the basis of sharing what you don't know and sharing when you're wrong. Sharing weaknesses is much, much more important than sharing strengths. And on that is the notion that no one has the monopoly on good ideas and no one is always wrong. So back to Pakistan again, 3.5 million people made homeless and thousands of square kilometres of terrain in the foothills of the Himalayas, just to give you a picture of what this looks like. The three mighty mountain ranges of the world, the Himalayas, the Karakoram and the Hindu Kush, all converge at the point in Khoistan, a region of Pakistan where the earthquake hit. And what a historically interesting part of the world it is, because basically where the epicenter of this earthquake was, where these three mountain ranges meet, because basically the earthquake happened because India is subducting under Asia, pushing Asia up, and the Himalayas are still growing. And the Pakistanis loved it when I used to joke saying, and we all knew this was India's fault. It's such an amazing area of these new mountains growing up before your eyes. It's the point at which Alexander the Great got to the Indus River, turned around and went, "I'm going home now," and then died. And when you stand at this meeting point of the three mountain ranges and you look across the Indus River to the other side, you see a footpath carved into the side of the mountain. That's where Marco Polo walked. What a fascinating part of the world. And in all of this, we had these big, tall, raw mountains, many mountains over 7,000 metres, 20 feet of snow coming down, a Himalayan winter, and we needed to keep 3.5 million people alive because their houses and farmlands were destroyed in an earthquake just as they were pre-stocking their food for winter. I and the Taliban were there, and Lashkar-e-Taiba were there, and the Lana controllers there. So we were actually starting to think we need to go high up into the mountains with the Pakistan army and forcibly move people down into displaced persons camps at the point of a gun if necessary. That's really the desperation we were getting to, because how do you feed 3.5 million people for 6 months? And this young intern from the local university was working in my office, and he came in and said, "Andrew, you're not using our brains." And I looked back at him and said, "Of course not. Someone's got to tell us where to buy pens, someone's got to tell us where to buy paper, someone's got to tell us how to get telephones connected, because you've got to do all this sort of stuff in Pakistan, right? You've got to do this stuff when you start a new emergency and you're coming from outside and you don't know how to do any of this. So you get an intern to help you with all the basic stuff." And he said, "Nope, use our brains." I said, "Okay, Einstein, I got 3.5 million people above 20,000 feet, 20 feet of snow is about to be dumped on them over the next 6 weeks. You tell me how to solve that problem." And off he goes. Next day he comes back in, he says, "Andrew, I think I got the solution." I'm like, "Really?" He said, yeah. The houses were not vaporised. They were destroyed. They fell, which means on the ground everywhere is a whole bunch of wood and a whole bunch of corrugated iron sheets. So rather than bring everyone down, why don't we just send engineers up to show people, and we had 8 engineering battalions the Pakistan Army gave us, show them how to build one warm room for winter, an A-framed house out of the collapsed rubble. I thought, that might work. Might work a little bit. I mean, it's not going to solve everything. So he ran a couple of experiments, flew a helicopter in, got some engineers, a bit of corrugated iron sheet, a few bits of wood, showed people how to do it. It worked. How do we expand this? We trained the entire Pakistan Army's engineering battalions over the next day or two what to do, and sent them off. In 6 weeks we built 400,000 emergency shelters. One warm room, Operation Winter Race. The idea came from one 21-year-old intern. Walked into my office and was brave enough to tell me I was wrong and I wasn't using his brain. And he came up with the idea that actually kept 3.5 million people alive. No one has the monopoly on good ideas. And no one is always wrong. Not even the idiot in your office is always telling you crap is always wrong. He or she might have the gem that solves things. Always listen to people. Lesson 4, strange teams and clear objectives. So you've got the Taliban. We know the Taliban. They're the people who run around yelling Allahu Akbar and then blow things up. Not necessarily a good collaborative partner. Cuba. Cuba still run by Fidel Castro then. Australia sent one field hospital to Pakistan, about 32 people. You know what Fidel Castro did? He lined up 5 747s at Havana airport, filled it with doctors, and sent 2,500 Cuban doctors. I mean, Cuba is a doctor factory. And they just sent 2,500 Cuban doctors. So they land in Pakistan wearing thongs, and shorts and t-shirts because they came from Havana. Very Latinic, so they sort of mix between men and women. Doesn't work in an Islamic community. And they had no tents. Now, USAID had a lot of tents, but the United States Foreign Aid Program isn't allowed to collaborate with Cuba, and no one's allowed to collaborate with the Taliban. So we went to a little place called Banna in the upper Swat Valley, and we sat down with the Taliban and said, right, how do we actually bring all of these foreign aid workers in without you people killing them and kidnapping them and dressing them in orange and putting them on YouTube? And the funny thing is, if you can get people to agree on your objective, you can actually create an astonishing team. And what was the objective? The objective was to keep 3.5 million people alive for 6 months. And no one wanted to be the person blamed for not keeping them alive. It's kind of a lesson we've all learned from Hamas. Look after the civilian population likes you. So we've suddenly all agreed we need to keep 3.5 million people alive. But we needed to set the guidelines. So USAID gave some tents to the Cubans, but we didn't tell Congress. For those on Periscope, because this is being broadcast live on Periscope, don't tell Congress. USAID gave the tents to the Cubans. But after a week or two, General Nadim and I got a group of local Islamic leaders coming in and saying, General Saab, Andrew Saab, we like the Cubans. There's just one problem. Like, what's the problem? The men and the women are sharing tents and we think they're having sex. To which my first response was, I wish I was a Cuban doctor. My second response was, So we had to call the Cuban ambassador in and explain what the problem was. Understand the local cultural sensitivities. And once the Cuban ambassador understood, he sent the message out to the doctors that they needed to gender separate their accommodation on one condition. And the condition was we taught them how to play cricket. So I'm not going to be surprised if sometime down the track Cuba will win the World Cup. Lesson 5. Know what is right and have a clear ethical framework for your decision making. My last day in Rwanda, I went to see General Kagame and I said, Sir, what do you want to do with Rwanda? He said, Andrew, I want reconciliation between Hutus and Tutsis. I'm like, yes, sir, cut the crap. This is my last day in Rwanda. Don't give me the political answer. He said, Andrew, you forget there wasn't one genocide this century. There were 3. 1952, 1974, 1994. Kagame was a survivor of the 1952 genocide, fleeing into Uganda. And he said there have been 3 genocides. If I don't get reconciliation between the Hutus and the Tutsis, there'll be a 4th genocide and my children will die. Okay, sold. Understand your motivational framework. Have a very clear ethical framework for your decision making and know what it is that you're trying to achieve. Because in the sort of work we do, we very rarely get leadership choices that are choosing between a good option and a bad option. Choosing between a good option and a bad option is really simple. You choose the good option. But what happens when you're choosing between a bad option and a bad option? You need to have an ethical framework that you use to be able to balance and judge which is the least bad option. For example, in Bosnia. We all heard about ethnic cleansing. What I'm about to describe could have been done by a Bosnian Serb, a Bosnian Croat or a Bosnian Muslim. They're as bad as each other. But this one just happened to be a Bosnian Serb. And he said, see that village down there? We're about to ethnically cleanse it. Can you please bust the people out? And we're the Red Cross, International Committee for the Red Cross. If you bust the people out, you save a couple of hundred people's lives. But you become the tool of ethnic cleansing. You're now on CNN headline news around the world. You are the tool of Serbian ethnic cleansing. You've shot the credibility of your organisation. And you're probably going to be blocked somewhere in the world from delivering humanitarian supplies because of what you've done in Bosnia. The power of the international media can do that. Some of you might remember Steve Pratt and Peter Wallace, the poor Australian care workers that got arrested by Slobodan Milosevic for spying. They were idiots. They had in their car information about troop movements and minefield locations and were dumb enough to try and take it across the border from Serbia into Croatia. The Serbian law that they contravened was basically the same as the Australian equivalent in the Australian Federal Crimes Act. Having information that is likely to cause harm. Troop movements and minefield locations, yes, that's likely to cause harm. Do aid workers need that information? Actually, you do, so you can avoid where troops are and where the minefields are. But do you need to have it on paper carrying it across the border into Croatia when you're fleeing the war zone, in that case Kosovo? No, you don't. So it was stupidity on a massive scale. I had a great deal of sympathy for Slobodan Milosevic on that occasion. Only that occasion. I met Milosevic and I've never had evil come through my hand as it did when that man shook mine. But the day Steve Pratt and Peter Wallace were arrested, I'd already left Yugoslavia and gone to Rwanda. And as I said before, I was allowed access to the Rwandan Army officer's mess. And I drove up to my car that day. Instead of the gates being opened by the security guard, which normally would happen, the gates stayed closed. I wound down my window. In came the AK-47, and the guard said, Steve Pratt and Peter Wallace are 2 former Australian military aid worker spies. You have 30 seconds to convince me you're not an aid worker spy. what you do in one country does impact on another. So when the Bosnian Serb says, will you ethnically cleanse that village down there, you know very well that if you say yes, you will save lives, but you will destroy the reputation of your organisation. Not a good idea. If you say no, the Serb commander says, well, that's okay, goes down the hill, kills a few people to make the others run away. It's not a good idea either. There is no third option in that case. There's no, just calm down, give me a few days to consult with people. No, I'm going down to ethnically cleanse that village now. You either bust the people out or you don't. You tell me now whether you are or you're not, and if you are, let them go, and if you don't, I'll shoot a few and make them run away. What's your ethical framework to make that decision? When you make that decision, are you going to be happy with the decision that you made, understanding it was the least bad of bad options? And leadership often is about determining the least bad of bad options and knowing your ethical framework to determine which way you'll decide. Lesson 7, sometimes just do it. No paralysis by analysis. Again, the Pakistan earthquake. 76,000 square kilometres, 1.5 million people, sorry, 3.5 million people, 1.5 million homes. What do? You're never going to get perfect information. You're never going to wait until you see this is the exact information, now plan and respond. Information in emergencies, as you know, sort of dribbles through. Make the best educated guess you can with the information you've got and then move on. But always verify. General Nadeem would start every meeting every morning with the following expression: let's check and adjust. What has happened overnight that we didn't know yesterday? Check our assumptions, check our planning, adjust the planning for the basis of what's coming overnight and then move on. But no paralysis by analysis. And lesson 8, adapt your methodology. So I say there are 3 types of leadership. Now there are books on leadership. There are thousands of books on leadership. Everyone's got their own view. Here's mine. Leadership can be one of 3 types. Leadership from in front, leadership from beside, and leadership from behind. Leadership from in front is your typical military. Come on, boys and girls, let's go. Leadership from beside is training everyone up. Come on, let's all do this together. Empower people. And then leadership from behind is the hardest bit. It is delegating. It is giving people the freedom to fail. Giving them the skills and the abilities, and then letting them go. Now, which is the best form of leadership? And guess what? It differs on your circumstances and on your team. Some teams and some team members will always perform best when leading from in front. Some will always perform best when leading from beside, and some will always perform best from leading from behind. Some will perform better in different circumstances, and your role as a pinnacle leader is to determine which of your team members in which circumstances need leadership from in front, beside or behind, which means you need to know the characteristics of all your team members to know which version of leadership you can apply for which circumstance. Leadership is hard, and leadership requires flexibility. So if you're one of those bombastic leaders that says, I am always right and you're following me all the time, please stop doing that. And if you see someone in your teams doing that, please coach them out of it. And if you have a boss that does that, good luck. The strength and the most powerful leadership is the humility to know when you're wrong, the humility to foster a team that will tell you when they think you are wrong, the ability to be able to feed back to the team when they are right and when they're not on that assessment, and to adjust your methodology to fit the circumstances and the people. There is no cookie cutter. Leadership 9, and this is the last leadership lesson before I go into a little bit of cultural change, break the silos of concentration. And what I mean by that, and you'll see that someone's in charge of emergency shelter, someone's in charge of food, someone's in charge of logistics. You'll have something similar in your circumstances. Who is the peak coordinator that sits above that to break the silos of concentration, break the silos of work to make sure there is an intercollaboration between different people? Let me now talk about, though, move on from the methodology of leadership to the context in which you will assert that leadership. Where is Australia in a changing world today? Now, our culture, the white Anglo-Saxon culture, is pretty bad at seeing change. In Victorian law, when the automobile was first created, there had to be a man waving a red flag walking in front of the automobile to not scare the horses. That stayed in Victorian law until 2002. It wasn't enforced, but it was still there. We're very bad at seeing change, and our culture is particularly bad at seeing change. Let me ask you a couple of trick questions. What was the Roman numeral for 0? Anyone? There wasn't one. How do you have the decimal system without the number 0? The heart of our decimal system, the heart of our money, the heart of our counting system is the number 0. It didn't exist in Roman times. It does exist now. So surely one of the most important people in our history is the person who invented and perfected 0. Who was? We didn't learn it. A Hindu invented it in India, but the guy that perfected it was this guy, Al-Khwarizmi, in a little town called Khiva in Uzbekistan. All right. Who determined the world was round, not flat? We learned Galileo. The problem with that is 200 years before Galileo, this guy, Mirza Ulugh did, in his observatory outside Samarkand in Uzbekistan. Hang on, they're both in Uzbekistan. What's the big deal about Uzbekistan between about the year 900 when Mirza Ulugh did this and about 1200 when he did that? Well, the Great Silk Road ran from Xi'an in China down to the Middle East, and basically halfway between those 2 points is Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan was the centre of the world. Now, we learned the years 400 to 1400 were the Dark Ages after the Romans left London because the world went backwards. The world did not go backwards. We did. Our culture did. Our culture lost knowledge. Our culture went backwards. The other cultures boomed in knowledge. Astronomy, mathematics, physics, science, and all happened outside our culture. So we have the cheek to think that Marco Polo discovered the Silk Road, the little route that he walked down in Pakistan. He didn't discover the Silk Road. The Silk Road was in existence for 1,000 years before Marco Polo got there. But we don't recognise it because our culture is really bad at recognising it. It's why we don't know who invented 0. It's why we still think Galileo discovered the world was round and he didn't. It's why we said the years 400 to 1400 were the Dark Ages, and they weren't, because the world didn't go backwards. The world progressed, but we went backwards. And we're making the same mistake today. Because we talk about China rising, and we look at graphs like this. So, wow, the Chinese economy is picking up. It's soon going to pass the United States. Let me give you another phrase. China is not rising, it's returning. And why do I say it's returning, not rising? Because when I put the graph out to the birth of Jesus Christ, I get this. And you see, India and China dominated GDP until here. And then they dropped down, and now they're ticking up. Now, what's the drop down and what's the ticking up? Before the Industrial Revolution, individual productivity around the world was more or less the same. The vast majority of people in the world were subsistence farmers. And you had a small ruling elite and a small trading class, but everyone was basically the same. In other words, at the global level, your population size and your economic size were in alignment. If you had big population, you had big economy. If you had small population, you had a small economy. And then we invented the Industrial Revolution. And we just got lucky that our culture did that. And we had a huge boom in individual productivity. We funded the age of empire, transportation, founding of Australia and the United States. And then what happened about here, where India and China are at the bottom, more or less, let's call it 1950. We started the information age, where we basically took information about individual productivity and gave it to everybody. We set up factories in China, call centres in the Philippines, IT hubs in India. We gave everybody the knowledge. So now around the world, partly because of the internet, there is no comparative advantage in knowledge at the macro level. So the reason China and India are now ticking up is because it's about implementation of the knowledge that's the same around the world. So I wouldn't say that China is rising. I wouldn't even say that China is returning. I would say the world is returning to balance, where your economic size and population size are returning back to alignment just as it always was. The norm of white Anglo-Saxon Christian cultures dominating global trade, dominating global politics that we think is the norm, actually is not the norm. It's only been for about 300 to 500 years. The norm is actually India, China, Asia. And that norm is based on demographics. And the moment you realise it's based on demographics and the world is returning to alignment where your population size and economic size are coming back to alignment, the fact that China's not going to dominate isn't because they're better than us or their culture is winning, it's the world is returning to the balance that it always had, except this short-term spike around the time of the Industrial Revolution. So the culture of global trade is changing, just like it has many times in history all the way down the Silk Road. Uzbekistan. It used to be in the middle of it, where all that great maths and science and astronomy is happening. There is no more a break between individual productivity and information. There's the global rebalancing between economic size and influence. There's a changing culture of global trade from the white Anglo-Saxon rules-based individualist culture back to the more collectivist culture that comes out of Asia. Now, I'm not saying what's right and what's wrong and what's better and what's worse. I'm just saying it's happening. And get ready for it to be happening. And what does this mean for Australia and for you? Because our culture is changing. As we shift this great culture from the Anglo-Saxon dominance to the Asian, Hindu, Buddhist, Islamic culture, wouldn't it be great if there was a country somewhere in the right time zone, in the right geography, with the right cultural mix of its population, which could be the hinge through which this great cultural change shifted? And fortunately for New Zealand, the country to its left is screwing up its opportunity. Because we're fascinated by 1,200 refugees in Manus and Nauru. We're not getting over the fact that we should just bring them in. And we are blowing our opportunity by telling all of the Asia-Pacific region, by putting out taxpayer-funded maps with a map of Australia, a red line through it, and the words, "No way, you'll never make Australia home," and somehow we're dumb enough to think only asylum seekers read it. And we are blowing our opportunity to be the hinge through which this great cultural transition shifts, and instead being the cringe. But how does this change more specifically for Australia? Well, 51% of Australians have one parent born overseas. 1/3 of Sydney is born overseas. We now have many different migrants coming in. Let's just take the Sudanese for a second. I'm not picking on the Sudanese because they're Sudanese. I'm picking on the Sudanese because they're particularly new. Think through the head of a Sudanese person. You come from a conflict zone. Who is the person you distrust most in Sudan? Military. People wearing what? A uniform. And what are you wearing when you attend an emergency? So are those types of people coming from the culture that they come from, given the circumstances of where they're coming from, are they likely to trust you or not trust you the moment they see you? They're not going to trust you. Is it their fault? No. It's just a cultural awareness. And one of the great shames, I think, in this country since 2001, since we've been anti-refugee, is we are no longer funding refugee integration programs when they come to this country. We're not teaching people as much as we should that, guess what? In this country, you trust a uniform. We've got to break generations of training when people come into this country. People don't learn this by osmosis, and we're doing them and us a great disservice by not being culturally aware. And with this great shift that's going on in the culture of global trade, the largest migrant markets for Australia now are India and China. Are we prepared for that cultural change and that cultural influx? Do your teams know how to deal with people from the different cultural backgrounds? One of the issues that's come up both last night and today is the issue of violence against emergency workers. How much of that is based on cultural misunderstandings that we as a nation haven't dealt with as part of our integration programs when people come, and therefore the first front line in the cultural misunderstanding is you and your teams. And have you prepared you and your teams for that? So what does that mean for you? You've got to have the cultural awareness for those in your teams and the people that you serve. Now, I know a lot of you, particularly I learned last night Victorian Ambulance is doing a lot in this area. That's fantastic. But we need to know about some of those issues like the distrust of uniforms, and how do we deal with the gender issues from different cultures. How do you know when a male medical worker may intervene with a female patient? How do we know when to recognise gender and sexual-based violence issues that need to be reported back? and how that needs to be done where we don't put the patient, the victim, in even more danger. There's a lot of complexity when you have a country like ours with hundreds of different cultures and hundreds of different cultural contexts where at the sharp end of an emergency, when you or your teams are attending an emergency, they need to have been empowered because you are leading from behind, empowering your staff members with training and education to be able to make those intercultural judgments on the spot in an emergency setting. Very, very tough to do. And it's got to be part of our preparation and training, and as leaders, it's part of your role as leaders to make sure that your teams are empowered to make those decisions. Now, as part of this great shift, we have the increasing ageing population problem in Australia. Did you know in Australia in the year 2012, more people left the job market by leaving than entering the job market through growing up? In other words, in 2012, the future ageing population became the present ageing population problem. And in 2012, the post-war baby boom became the post-war retirement boom. So the challenge that your industry has is we're having an increasing demand on health services, particularly through the ageing population, at a time when we are shrinking the tax base and therefore governments have more pressure to reduce funding. So how do we increase services in a time of reduced funding? That's a really hard balance that we need to figure out. And I don't have an answer for that. But I want to conclude before questions with one little story. And the little story is why I admire your work so much. And the story goes like this. It was 1990. It was 2 a.m. the morning of the 2nd of January, so the day after New Year's Eve. Driving from Geelong back to Melbourne, along the Geelong Road. Who's from Victoria? So you know where I'm coming. You're coming down the Geelong Road, about 15, 20 minutes outside of Geelong. The road curves around to the left. I'm driving down with a fellow named Andrew Farquhar. We were both officer cadets together, and this car went zooming by us. And then off in the distance we saw this car roll. We pulled over the side of the road and we thought, let's see if the ambos need a hand. And as we're running up like heroes to this car on its roof, it suddenly struck us, there are no ambos here yet. This just happened. And you would have seen this gosh knows how many times. So we crawled inside the car, and the driver had his feet pinned underneath the pedals, and the steering wheel had come through as the car crashed and twisted his torso off his legs. There's no doubt that guy was dead. The centrifugal force of the car rolling, the police told us later it rolled 21 times, took all the blood in his body and just went foofed, and his skin was the same colour as the paper. The guy in the passenger seat had his head 3/4 decapitated by the seatbelt. He was just dead. And the guy in the back was, well, just dead. And we're like, we better have a look around here. So we did a circular search pattern as one of the truckies who just stopped had called the ambos. And we found this woman who'd been thrown out of the car when it was rolling. And she hit a tree, and her body just went and wrapped around the tree and fell. Every bone from here down was shattered. And she was sort of lying like this. We're like, for God's sake, what do we do? Let's just monitor until the ambulance gets there. Clear some teeth out of the airway, make sure the tongue was out. And then the worst point came about 7 or 8 minutes later when the pulse went. What do you do with a girl with every bone shattered at the bottom of a tree, lying on her side, and the pulse and the breathing goes? Do you roll her over and start the CPR with all the risk that then comes with whatever is happening inside the skeleton? Or do you just leave nature take its course? There's no real good option there. And as we're about to roll her over to start the CPR, the pulse came back. So we just monitored, and when the ambulance came, they shut off the Geelong Road, and the helicopter came down, and the police came, and the fire trucks came. And the ambos sat us down and said, look, you guys have done a really good job, but she's not going to live. We're going to fly her off to the Alfred Hospital, see what happens. But the ambos took some really good time to de-stress us, to debrief us on what we'd been through, because they'd been through it so many times. As it turned out, Maria Calafiore lived. She had a 2-month memory gap around the collision, but that's it. She learned to walk again after about 6 months. Her and her 3 colleagues had just been voted the best unsigned rock band in Australia that year, and they'd been celebrating. 3 of them are dead. And Maria has gone on to live a very, very good life, largely because of, well, we had a little part, but then the way your people kept her alive. Now that is an amazing part of my life, a once-off, but you people do this every day. So for that, I want to thank you, and thank you very much for listening to me.